In 490 BC, the Athenians achieved an unexpected triumph over the Persian Empire at the Battle of Marathon. As part of his campaign to punish the Greek city-states that had supported the Ionian revolt and expand the Persian Empire, King Darius I launched the first Persian invasion of Greece. Thus, on the plain of Marathon, nearby to Athens, the Persian army descended, bolstered by a coastal fleet and a numerically superior force. Despite being outnumbered, Miltiades led the Athenian army, supplemented by a small contingent from Plataea, into an attack on the Persians. He used a novel tactic to encircle the Persian forces by weakening their center lines and strengthening their flanks. Massive Persian casualties and a shattered battle line were the result of this strategic move, sending the Persians fleeing in disarray back to their ships. The morale of all Greek city-states was greatly boosted by the triumph, which proved that the Persians could be vanquished. Legends abound commemorating the battle and its significance in defending Greek liberty and political autonomy. One such legend is that of Pheidipides, the messenger who ran from Marathon to Athens to announce the victory, a story that is said to have inspired the modern marathon event of our Olympic Games. Hello and welcome to the channel. If you're new here, good to meet you, and for those coming back, good to see you again. Off we go back to ancient Greece today. That is going to be fun. Supporting the channel is just enjoying the channel, and I certainly hope you're doing that. The like and subscribe's up there too, and if you feel the need to look in the description, you may find some other links that are perhaps relevant to you. But first, let's get nice and relaxed and we can begin with today's topic. Initiated largely by the Ionian revolt, the Persian invasion of Greece marked the beginning of the Greco-Persian Wars. You see, both sides had been interacting for a long time, and this war was the result of both the revolt and their reactions to it. The young Persian Empire was rapidly expanding by 500 BC, but it was beset by insurgencies among the peoples it had conquered. When King Darius took the throne, he wasted no time in putting an end to the various rebellions. He had already expanded Persian influence into Europe before the Ionian revolt broke out, subjugating Thrace and establishing Macedon as a tributary state. At the time, Greece was politically divided, which made it an easy target for the Persians to expand into, little by little. Now, the Ionian revolt demonstrated the danger that the Greek city-states could present to the Persian stability. Thus, in retaliation for the uprising, Darius plotted a punishing expedition to conquer the Aegean and Greece. Aristagoras, the tyrant of Miletus, and Artaphernes, a Persian satrap, launched an unsuccessful assault on Naxos to start the war. Artaphernes decided to depose Aristagoras after the endeavor failed, and the democratic government that Aristagoras founded in Miletus, which he had renounced in anticipation of his dismissal, sparked rebellion in other cities of the Ionian region. Aristagoras sought out allies on the Greek mainland, but he only received military backing from Athens and Eretria. a number of internal political events, most notably the birth of democracy following the deposal of Athens dictator Hippias in 510 BC, impacted the Athenians' choice to put their support behind the revolt. Hippias, the exiled son of Pisistratus, the political tycoon of Athens, sought asylum in Sardis with Artaphernes. In return for help re-establishing his rule, he pledged to subjugate Athens to Persian influence. At the same time, Cleisthenes and the Alcmeonidae family, who saw themselves as the rightful rulers of Athens, were greatly dismayed when Cleomenes I of Sparta installed Isagoras, who favored a pro-Spartan administration. Cleisthenes formed a new political faction, with strong support from the Athenians after losing politically to the coalition headed by Isagoras. Although this strategy was initially successful, Cleisthenes and other prominent members of the Alcmeonid family were exiled when Cleomenes I of Sparta returned to Athens at the request of Isagoras. The Athenians rose up in rebellion against Cleomenes and Isagoras' attempts to create an absolute oligarchy, and drove them from power. Thus, the Athenians were given more power when Cleisthenes swiftly instituted reforms upon his return in 507 BC. These reforms did not instantly create a complete democracy, but they did set the foundation for it. Now, Athens' newfound independence made the city-state extremely resistant to rule by Sparta, Persia, or anybody that wasn't Athens. And fair enough. Cleomenes was so unhappy that he led the Spartan army into Athens to try to oust Isagoras, but they were unsuccessful. Simultaneously, Athens turned to Artaphernes in Sardis for assistance in their fear of the outcome, and Artaphernes demanded the traditional symbols of submission, earth and water. Despite receiving severe criticism upon their return to Athens, the Athenian ambassadors acquiesced. Hippias fled back to Sardis and begged the Persians for help in recapturing Athens after Cleomenes' attempts to restore the exiled tyrant failed as well. Athens responded by sending emissaries to Artaphernes in an attempt to dissuade him from supporting Hippias. But Artaphernes instead demanded that he be reinstated. The city-state of Athens refused, and instead readied itself for war with Persia, joining forces with the rebellious Ionian cities. This was especially true, given that many of these cities had been Athens' colonies, and had since become democratic republics. Afterwards, 25 triremes, that's a kind of ship that they had in ancient Greece, quite effective, were dispatched by Athens and Eretria to lend support to the Ionian revolt. They marched on Sardis and burned down the lower city. But unfortunately, the triumph was fleeting, and they were routed to the coast by the Persian armies, suffering heavy casualties in the process. Despite their withdrawal, King Darius of Persia became even more enraged by Athens and Eretria as a result of their daring move, and he vowed to take vengeance upon them. The Ionian revolt came to a close with the Persian conquest of Lade in 494 BC. The Persian fleet had already subdued the remaining rebels by 493. Previously, ungoverned territories in the Propontis and the eastern Aegean were incorporated into the Persian Empire by Darius during this juncture. Once they had Ionia under control, the Persians could finally punish Athens and Eretria for their role in the Persian threat. After the Ionian revolt was put down in 492, Darius dispatched an expedition to Greece, led by Mardonius, his son-in-law. In addition to re-subjugating Thrace, Mardonius fully subjugated Macedonia to Persia, ending its previous status as a relatively independent vassal. However, his fleet was destroyed in a violent storm, and the campaign came to a premature end. When Hippias fled to the son of the satrap Artaphernes, and the Median admiral Datis led another expedition in 490, Darius was once again in charge. The injury Mardonius suffered in the last campaign caused him to lose favor with the team, and the new expedition's goals were to conquer or destroy Eretria and Athens in Greece, punish Naxos for its resistance in 499, and incorporate the Cyclades into the Persian Empire. By carefully hopping around from island to island across the Aegean, the Persian army captured and punished Naxos before reaching midsummer off the coast of Euboea. After sieging, capturing, and burning Eretria, they swung south towards Attica to punish Athens, the campaign's ultimate goal. And there, at the Bay of Marathon, about 27 kilometers northeast of Athens, the Persians touched ground, with the advice of the exiled Athenian dictator Hippias. Then, under the command of the seasoned general Miltiades, the Athenians wasted no time advancing to Marathon in an effort to cut off the Persians' access to the plain and their ability to push further inland. At the same time, Pheidippides, Athens' fastest runner, was sent to Sparta to ask for military aid. However, his arrival occurred during the Carneia festival, which meant that the Spartans would have to wait at least 10 days for the full moon before they could get ready to go for battle. Even though the arrival of 1,000 hoplites from the small city of Plataea boosted morale and secured eternal Athenian gratitude, the Athenians had to hold their ground at Marathon in the meantime. And looking out at the Persians' army's numbers, it was not going to be easy. Thus, over the plain of Marathon, the two armies engaged in a stalemate that lasted for approximately 5 days. Now, it was either a forest of trees or an abatis of stakes that protected the flanks of the Athenians' camp. As the Athenians' arrival drew nearer by the day, the delay worked in the Athenians' favor. Athletes selected one general from each of their 10 tribes to lead the army, and Miltiades was one of them, and the entire citizen body elected Callimachus to be the polemarch, the war archon. Herodotus states that the strategoi, or the general, took turns in being in charge, but on Miltiades' day, they all yielded to his command. Even though he knew that the Spartans were on their way, Miltiades waited until his command day to take the attack to the Persians, according to Herodotus at least. Problems do arise with this account due to the lack of proof of rotating generalship, and the fact that the Athenians gained very little benefit from attacking before the Spartans arrived. The arrival of the Athenians at Marathon was preceded by the battle of discernible lag. It is possible that Herodotus made a mistake in his explanation of this delay because he thought Miltiades was eager to attack. But Herodotus is going to do what Herodotus does, and that is write somewhat questionable accounts. Well, as we will see later on, the main reason for the hold-up was likely just that the Persians and the Athenians weren't ready to risk fighting at first, and because of this we sort of have to wonder why the conflict did happen at that particular time. While all of the sources do agree with Herodotus that the Greeks attacked the Persians first, the motivation behind this action prior to the arrival of the Spartans remains a bit of a mystery. To put it simply, there's two competing hypotheses. Well, according to the first school of thought, the Persian cavalry withdrew from Marathon, and upon seeing them go, the Greeks took the advantage of launching an attack. An entry in the Suda dictionary, and the fact that Herodotus does not mention cavalry in his account of the battle, provides the groundwork for this theory. But the most common version of this theory holds that the cavalry were to be sent by sea to attack an undefended Athens at the rear, as the remaining Persians pinned down the Athenian army at Marathon, while the other version states that they were completing the tedious process of re-embarking on the ships, and if you've ever tried to get a horse on a boat, you know what they're talking about. So, this theory takes Herodotus at his word and says that the Persian army started re-embarking after Marathon with the intention of sailing around Cape Sognon and attacking Athens directly. Therefore, this re-embarkation must have happened prior to the battle, and possibly even caused it. The alternate explanation is that the Persians' decision to attack on the Athenians was the sole cause of the conflict. Assuming that the Athenians took the tactical offensive and attacked the Persians when they saw their advance, this theory can be reconciled with the traditional account of the Persians attacking the Athenians, even though this theory has the Persians moving to the strategic offensive. Obviously, we don't really have enough evidence to say which theory is more plausible. Nevertheless, according to both explanations, the conflict was precipitated by Persian actions that took place on or around the fifth day. There is another possibility, that both explanations are true. The Persians launched their assault on Athens with their cavalry by ship, while simultaneously launching their infantry attack on Marathon, which led to the Greek counterattack. Well, dates of various events are provided by Herodotus, utilizing the lunar solar calendar, which differed among the Greek city-states. Historians can utilize astronomical calculations to transform these dates into the proleptic Julian calendar, which is widely used for establishing chronology. This date has been traditionally acknowledged since 1855, when Philip August Bock demonstrated that the fight occurred on September 12th, 490 BC, based on the calculations of the Julian calendar. But this finding is conditional on when exactly the Spartan festival took place. After all, the Spartan calendar might have been a month earlier than the Athenians. On the 12th of August, 490 BC, if this were true, then the conflict would have taken place. Well, Herodotus does not specify how many Athenians were in the army during the Battle of Marathon. Ancient historians and chroniclers like Plutarch, Cornelius Nepos, and Pausanias all attest that 9,000 Athenians and 1,000 Plataeans made up the Athenian army. In contrast, according to Justin, there were 10,000 Athenians and 1,000 Plataeans. The quantity of soldiers sent by the Athenians and Plataeans to the Battle of Plataea 11 years later is remarkably similar to these figures, according once again to Herodotus. And Pausanias further mentioned that the monument honoring the fight had the names of enslaved people who had been released in return for their military service. These figures are usually considered plausible by modern historians. The entire Athenian army at Marathon and Plataea would have constituted around 3% of the total population, considering that the population of Attica, the area governed by Athens, was around 315,000 at the time, and that is including slaves. This estimate shows the crucial role that these battles played in Athenian and Greek history, highlighting the massive mobilization of resources by the Athenians in reaction to this collective threat from the Persians. Darius commanded a fleet of 600 triremes, as reported by Herodotus. The Persians' army's size is not really mentioned, but he does say that it was large and densely packed. There are a variety of Persian force estimates found in other ancient sources. For example, Simonides, a poet who lived at the same time or around it, claims that the number of campaigners was 200,000. According to the Roman historian Cornelius Nepos, there were around 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 mounted troops, but only 100,000 fought on land, and the remaining were on the last fleet that rounded Cape Sounion. The numbers that the Suda dictionary, Plutarch, and Pausanias all came up with are around 300,000. Lysias and Plato both say 500,000, and Justinus says 600,000. Of course, I will remind you, you should probably not take those numbers too seriously. Now, the number of Persian infantrymen has been estimated by modern historians to be anywhere from between 20,000 to 100,000, with 25,000 being the most commonly accepted figure. On average, 1,000 people make up the cavalry. While the Ionians and Aeolians were among the many contingents from the Achaemenid Empire that made up the fleet, they are not specifically named as having fought in the battle, and may have stayed on board. The Persians and Sacae were prominent figures in Herodotus' account of the Achaemenid line's central section at Marathon. He recounts, "They fought a long time at Marathon. In the center of the line the foreigners prevailed, where the Persians and Sacae were arrayed. The foreigners prevailed there, and broke through in pursuit inland, but on each wing the Athenians and Plataeans prevailed. In victory, they let the routed foreigners flee, and brought the wings together to fight those who had broken through the center. The Athenians prevailed, then followed the fleeing Persians and struck them down. When they reached the sea, they demanded fire and laid hold of the Persian ships. End of the account from Herodotus. While the Athenians faced multiple strategic obstacles during the Battle of Marathon, even after deploying all of their hoplites to confront the Persians, they were likely outnumbered by a factor of 2 or more. Athens was extremely exposed after its full mobilization, leaving it practically defenseless against any attack, and effectively opening the door to a secondary Persian maneuver that could cut off their forces from the city. Losing at Marathon would spell disaster for the Athenians, because they had no backup army. Strategically, they aimed to engage the Persian forces at Marathon in a way that would prevent them from being outmaneuvered and flanked by blocking the plain's exits. The Athenians still had important strategic advantages, though, despite all the limitations. You see, they had successfully confined the Persians to the plain of Marathon, so there was no immediate need to fight. But with each passing day, the Athenians' chances of receiving reinforcements from the Spartans grew. The Athenians chose to play defense in the early stages of the conflict, because attacking was fraught with danger, and delaying might have paid dividends. The Athenians chose to remain on the defensive was even more justified when they considered the weakness of hoplites against cavalry and the formidable cavalry forces of the Persians. It is probable that the Persian strategy revolved around their tactical alternatives. Later battles, such as Plataea and Thermopylae, would demonstrate that Persian infantry, in contrast to Greek hoplites, were unprepared for direct confrontations due to their lighter and less armored nature. It is possible that the Persians were discouraged from launching a frontal attack by the Athenians' formidable defensive position. The Athenians had set up a camp on a spur of Mount Agrielice, which provided commanding views of the Marathon plain. In fact, the ruins of these towers can still be seen today. That's one to put on your list, isn't it? Imagine you stand at the ruins of those towers and look down upon those plains. Ah, history is alive. Anyway, although the precise cause of the conflict is still up for discussion, it did change the strategic or tactical balance of power in favor of taking action. It would have been strategically necessary and opportune for the Athenians to launch an offensive maneuver if the widely held belief that the Persian cavalry was momentarily off the field were correct. Another possible interpretation is that the Athenians were actually forced to act swiftly due to a sudden change in the battlefield dynamic, which could have been prompted by a Persian offensive move. A static defense by the Athenians would not have worked against the Persian forces' high proportions of missile troops. The hoplites' power came from fighting in close quarters, so they had to rush the Persians into a fight. The question of why the Persians waited a few days before launching the attack arises if they were the ones to start it. Now, this could have been due to the number of strategic considerations. The Persians could have known or suspected that the reinforcements from Athens were indeed approaching, or they could have felt that they needed to win decisively so they could leave Marathon indefinitely. Well, either way, on the day of the battle, when the gap between the two armies was about 1,500 meters, the Athenian general Miltiades formed a strategic formation. The two main tribes, Themistocles Leontis and Aristides Antiochus, were arranged in a 4-rank depth. On the other hand, the tribesmen who occupied the flanks were organized into 8-man ranks. Some contemporary observers have hypothesized that this was a strategic move to allow for a double encirclement of the Persian center. However, this view assumes an advanced degree of military skill and training among all the Greeks, which was, it seems to be, probably non-existent during that period. I mean, we're talking about around 500, 400 BC. In fact, it wasn't until 371 BC, the Battle of Leuctra, that such an intricate tactical planning is seen anywhere in Greek warfare. But back to the topic. Well, to prevent the Greeks from being outflanked, it's more likely that this formation was meant to make sure the Athenian line was as long as the Persian line. By making this last-minute change, the Athenians were able to meet the Persians halfway between their needs for depth and breadth in the ranks, resulting in a formidable front line. Reportedly, after the Athenians had reformed their line, Miltiades issued a straightforward order to advance, saying, "At them." Now, it was thought physically impossible for the Athenians to run the whole distance to the Persian lines while wearing the heavy armor, but Herodotus seems to think otherwise. I'm not sure if Herodotus has ever donned a full suit of that kind of armor, but I have worn a kind of 3/4 length shirt of chainmail before, one that goes kind of halfway down the thigh. And let me tell you, even walking in one of them is, well, you can't do it for too long. Great training, though, I will say that. Well, the Athenians probably marched until they were about 200 meters from the Persian archers' effective range, and then started running toward the enemy. It's also possible that they ran in disorganized formation until they reached the 200-meter mark, after which they reformed for the last push into combat. Herodotus implies that the Greek army had never charged into battle before, most likely due to the novelty of facing an enemy whose primary weapon was missiles. Now, the Persians were taken aback by this strategy and thought the Athenians were practically insane when they charged. In their minds, they charged the Athenians with madness which must be fatal, seeing that they were few and yet pressing forwards at a run, having neither cavalry or archers of their own. The Persians may have anticipated a different strategy from the Greeks based on their past encounters. But that's not what they got. The Athenians advanced through the Persian arrow barrage and finally made contact with the Persian army. At Marathon, a sharp and protracted conflict erupted. The Persians and Sacae, who were stationed in the middle of the line, broke through and pursued the Greeks inland after gaining the upper hand. Athenian and Plataean forces were able to vanquish their enemies on both flanks. the Athenian wings rapidly overcame the less experienced Persian levies positioned on the flanks. These Persian troops, lacking the discipline and training of the Greek hoplites, were unable to withstand the determined assault, and soon broke, fleeing the battlefield. Once the flanks were routed, the Athenian wings executed a coordinated inward maneuver, turning towards the center of the Persian formation. This move effectively encircled the Persian center, which had initially managed to push back the thinner Greek center due to its stronger and more concentrated forces. The combined pressure from the Athenian wings closing in on both sides overwhelmed the Persian center, leading to its eventual collapse. The battle concluded when the Persian center, seeing their flanks routed and realizing they were being encircled, broke into panic and fled towards their ships, closely pursued by the Greeks. Unfamiliar with the local terrain, many Persians ran towards the swamps, where an unknown number of them drowned. The Athenians chased the retreating Persians back to their ships, managing to capture a few of them, though the majority successfully launched and escaped. Herodotus recounts a dramatic incident involving King Darius, the brother of the playwright Aeschylus, who was among the Athenian fighters on that very day. King Darius charged into the sea, grabbed a Persian trireme, and began pulling it towards the shore. A member of the ship's crew saw him and cut off his hand, and Cineagus died as a result. Well, according to Herodotus, 6,400 Persian corpses were counted on the battlefield, with an unknown number perishing in the swamps. He also recorded that the Athenians lost 192 men, while the Plataeans lost about 11. Among the fallen were the war archon, the polemarch Callimachus, and the general Stesilaos. The Greek success at Marathon can be attributed to several factors, primarily superior equipment and tactics. Herodotus notes that the Greeks, though not using bronze armor but rather leather or linen, were still better equipped for combat, and the phalanx formation which the hoplites used was particularly effective because these soldiers were well versed in hand-to-hand combat, unlike the Persian troops, who were accustomed to a different type of warfare. And thus at Marathon, the Athenians deliberately thinned their center to match the length of the Persian line, rather than through any sophisticated tactical planning. And the Persian center, realizing their wings had been broken, attempted to regroup but was unfortunately caught in the flanks by the victorious Greeks. Now, Lazenby in 1993 suggests that the ultimate reason for the Greek victory was the courage displayed by Greek soldiers. He said, "Marathon was won because ordinary amateur soldiers found the courage to break into a trot when the arrows began to fall, instead of grinding to a halt, and when, surprisingly, the enemy wings fled, not to take the easy way out and follow them, but to stop and come to the aid of the hard-pressed center." Another modern historian, Vic Hurley, attributes the Persian defeat to their failure to field a representative army, calling the battle the most convincing example of the ineffectiveness of infantry bowmen in close-quarters combat without support from cavalry or fortifications. As soon as the battle ended, Herodotus stated that the Persian fleet had planned to attack Athens directly from the direction of Cape Sonion. The exact timing of this maneuver is a matter of debate, however, but regardless of when it happened, the Athenians swiftly realized that their city was still under threat. The two central tribes of the Athens line, under Aristides' command, were left to guard the battlefield as they returned to Athens as quickly as possible. The Persians were unable to secure a landing because the Athenian forces had reached Athens at the last possible moment. The Persians saw this as a missed opportunity and headed back to Asia. A prominent Athenian aristocratic family, the Alcmaeonids, were allegedly involved in this Persian maneuver, according to Herodotus. There was supposedly a shield signal given after the battle, but no one knows for sure what it means or how accurate it is. Well, after completing the 220 kilometers, 140 miles in just 3 days, the Athenian army arrived at Marathon the day after the battle. On their tour of the battlefield, they paid tribute to the Athenians' decisive triumph. 2 tumuli on the battlefield were built to honor the burial of the Athenians and Plataeans who died at Marathon. The Athenians' tomb bore the inscription of an epigram written by Simonides. Fighting at the forefront of the Greeks, the Athenians at Marathon laid low the army of the Gilded Medes. Following the conclusion of the battle, Darius began the process of putting together a massive new army, with the objective of completely undermining Greece. On the other hand, in the year 486 BC, a rebellion occurred among his Egyptian subjects, which put any expedition against Greece on hold. While Darius was making preparations to march on Egypt, he passed away, and his son Xerxes I succeeded to the throne of the Persian Empire. In a short amount of time, Xerxes was able to put down the Egyptian uprising and resume making preparations to invade Greece. And beginning in the year 480, the second Persian invasion began. The invasion was initially marked by victories for the Persians at Thermopylae and Artemisium. Following the evacuation of Athens by the Athenians, the Persians set fire to the city, leaving it in ruins. However, they were ultimately defeated at the Battle of Salamis, which was the ultimate turning point in the conflict, thanks to Themistocles, best general that Athens ever had. Well, until he decided to stab everybody in the back. But hey, go and watch the video on Themistocles if you want to know about that. Well, despite the fact that the defeat at Marathon had a negligible effect on the vast resources of the Persian Empire, the Greeks regarded it as extremely significant, and as a result it was the first time that the Greeks were successful in defeating the Persians. This victory demonstrated that the Persian forces were not as invincible as they seemed, and that resistance, rather than submission, was a viable option. Well, according to the famous opinion of John Stuart Mill, the Battle of Marathon, even as an event in British history, is more important than the Battle of Hastings. In a similar manner, Isaac Asimov suggested that if the Athenians had lost in Marathon, Greece might have never gone to develop the peak of its civilization, a peak whose fruits we modernists have inherited. But of course, we really remember it from the legend. Herodotus states that on the eve of the battle, the Athenians dispatched the runner Pheidippides to Sparta to beg for help. He reached Sparta the day after setting out, having run more than 225 kilometers. And then, after the battle, the Athenians marched rapidly back to Athens, covering roughly 40 kilometers in order to ward off the Persian fleet sailing around Cape Sounion. This was necessary due to the heavy armor and exhaustion of the soldiers, and the Persian ships turned their backs on Athens when they saw their return in the late afternoon, which sealed the Athenian triumph. Well, in subsequent popular imaginations, these two occurrences are actually a little mixed up, resulting in a legendary but false account of what transpired. In this legend, Pheidippides dashes from Marathon to Athens following the fight, proclaiming the Greek triumph with the cry, "We've won!" And then he succumbs to fatigue, dying on the spot. Thersippus of Erchius, or Eucles, is the name of the runner mentioned for the first time in Plutarch's 1st century AD on the Glory of Athens, where he cites Heraclides of Pontus's lost work. And in the 2nd century AD, Lucian of Samosata recounts a similar tale. But instead of Pheidippides, he calls the runner Philippides. Philippides is the name that appears in several medieval and even modern editions of Herodotus for the runner who traveled between Athens and Sparta prior to the battle. Well, at the tail end of the 19th century, when the concept of a modern Olympics was first mooted, its proponents sought for a magnificent popularizing event that would harken back to Greece's ancient glory. It was one Michael Brielle who proposed the concept of a marathon race in 1896 in Athens, the site of the first modern Olympic Games. The modern Olympic Games creator, Pierre de Coubertin, and the Greeks were both strongly in favor of this concept. After all, why wouldn't they? The competitors would run from Marathon to Athens, just like in the legendary version of the events. And, of course, the event became a staple of the Olympic Games after its meteoric rise to fame, inspiring other cities around the world to host their own versions every year. After initially fluctuating between 40 and 25 miles or thereabout, the distance between Marathon and Athens was eventually set to 26 miles, or around 42 and a bit kilometers. And that's the legacy of the marathon to this very day. Well, thank you very much for listening. The Battle of Marathon. What an epic. I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons, Britt, Charles, Stark Factory, JC, Jeffrey, Wendy, Tim, James, Aaron, Scott, Dark, Ben, and Melissa. Thank you very much for joining me again tonight, or this morning, this afternoon, whether you're dozing off to sleep, cooking yourself a meal, or doing something in the garden. Perhaps you are finishing off the new Warhammer Age of Sigmar Skaven Tide box. I'm working through it myself. Thank you very much, everybody. With lots of love to you all, and my deep appreciation for you listening this far. Once again, I wish you good night, sweet dreams.